Netball Australia have been in the news of late, and most of it not exactly positive. At the start of the month, they revealed that they had sold the rights to host the Super Netball Grand Final to Perth, whereas previously it had been awarded to the winner of the major semi-final. And then last week, it had to refute reports it was on the brink of collapse, but may have to turn to gambling revenue to boost income. So I figured I'd roll up my sleeves and have a look. Let's dive in. Whilst Netball Australia do make their annual reports available on their website, the full financial report isn't included, which is fine, but did mean that I had to go to ASIC to get some additional detail. This analysis will only run to their 31 December 2020 year-end report, as they have yet to submit their 21 financials. I've gone back the last 11 years here to 2010. Over that time, Netball Australia have earned $227 million in revenue and incurred $225 million in expenses, or, as they like to term it, investments in netball. As you can see, revenues and expenses have increased over this period, from $7 million in revenue and $7.3 million in expenses in 2010 through to $28.7 million in revenue and $31.6 million in expenses in 2020. There are two evident bumps in activity that can be seen. The first, in 2013, was when they received a $4.5 million grant from the government to assist them building Netball HQ. This grant was included in revenue. The second was that in 2015, Australia hosted the Netball World Cup in Sydney. Netball Australia recorded $12.4 million in revenue and $9.6 million in expenses in relation to this, with a $2.2 million distribution of surplus. That distribution was recorded as an expense. If we adjust for these two things, we can see a much clearer linear trend through to 2019. 2020 saw a decline in revenues and a slight increase over trend in expenses. An important point to raise here is that Netball Australia waived the contribution fees it normally receives from members in 2020. This normally equates to about $2.3 million. Given the circumstances of COVID and what it meant for community sport in 2020, this seems like a reasonable decision. Their deficit would have only been in the order of about $500,000 with that revenue coming in. All in all, when looking at their profitability over the past 11 years, it's usually pretty close to break even. But three big years stand out. 2013, when they received the government building grant. 2016, this was post-World Cup and pre-Super Series. And 2020, COVID. If the media reports are correct that it lost $4.4 million during 2021, this would be its biggest loss on record. And yes, COVID has continued to play a role, although other sports did see their bottom lines bounce back last year. Getting into the detail of the P&L, over the last 11 years, they've generated nearly 80% of their revenue from three key sources. $78.6 million through sponsorship, $61.3 million through government grants, and $36.1 million through events like the World Cup, Super Netball, and so on. Looking at the trends in revenue over time, sponsorship and grants have gone up substantially. Super Netball revenue has remained pretty consistent once it came in, but non-Super Netball event revenue has declined. Turning now to the expenses side of things. The three largest expense items over the past 11 years have been $53.7 million for media and sponsorship, $50.9 million for events, and $47.7 million for employees. Looking at key expenses over time, the following observations can be made. The first is that media is up substantially, from a low of $1 million in 2010 to $9.4 million in 2020. Employee benefits have also increased substantially, from a low of $2 million in 2010 to $7.3 million in 2020. Event costs are up as well, from about $2 million prior to Super Netball to about $8 million per annum since it began. Super Netball has brought in about $1.5 million in revenue over the time that it's been on, so it is running at a significant loss. Governance has increased from a low of $152,000 in 2011 to $956,000 in 2020. And finally, depreciation is up. And with a new building, this isn't surprising. This is about $130,000 per year pre the building, Netball HQ, to a high of nearly $800,000 in 2020. A number of expense items have gone down over the period though. High performance, more recently was about $2.3 million in 2017. In 2020 was only $1.4 million. And sport development was about $2.3 million in 2015, and since that point has trended downwards to just over $600,000 in 2020. With the building of Netball HQ in 2013, there was a major increase in PPE, and thus assets in 2013. From that point onwards, total assets have remained at about $15 million or thereabouts, with about 2/3 of that being cash. Liabilities have been slowly climbing through the period, from about $2 million in 2010 through to about $7 million in 2019, of which nearly all were current liabilities. So these are things which are due or payable within the next 12 months. $4.6 million were trade and other payables, while $1.1 million were contract liabilities, and these are mainly unspent grant revenues. In 2020, however, this $7 million increased sharply to $12.8 million. This $5.8 million increase primarily comes from a $2.7 million loan that was taken out, and this was secured over their property and is due in 2023. An additional $1.8 million in contract revenue, and an additional $1.1 million in trade and other payables. Now, at the end of 2020, they still had about $4.5 million of positive equity, but by the sounds of things, that may now have completely eroded. So what does this all mean? Overall, for a COVID-affected sport, these financials don't really look that out of place. Yes, they took out a $2.7 million loan, but given that no one really knew how things were going to unfold in 2020, this seems like not an unreasonable course of action. Their auditors, KPMG, gave them an unqualified opinion with no emphasis of matter in 2020. So that is a positive thing. One thing that I do find interesting, though, is how late they've been in submitting their documents. Prior to 2019, the average gap between the end of the financial year and submitting financials to ASIC was about 110 days. For their 2019 report, this nearly doubled to 205 days. But then again, this was right around the time that COVID was really starting to bite, so that's somewhat understandable. What I don't get is what happens next. The 2020 annual report with the year-end date of 31 December 2020 was lodged by Kelly Ryan, their company secretary, on the 30th of March 2022. That's a full 454 days later. Strangely enough, though, the director's report was signed off by Paulina Hunt and Peter Legg on the 5th of March 2021, and the audit report was signed off by Amanda Bond, who is no relation, on the 9th of March 2021. Yet it took over a year for these documents to be lodged with ASIC. It would be interesting to know what happened there. And currently, it's been 173 days and counting for their 2021 financials. If you made it this far, I hope you found it useful. If you like the work I'm doing here and would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and also don't forget to hit the notification bell. Cheers.